And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, I'm really excited. My guest is Mitch Joel. When brands like Google, Starbucks, Shopify, and GE want to leverage technology to better connect with their consumers, they call Mitch. He's been called one of North America's leading visionaries. His first book was Pixels of Separation, named after his blog and his podcast. And his second book was called Control Alt Delete. He's a speaker, he's an advisor, he's an author. He is the perfect guest to have on and share his journey with us today. So welcome aboard, Mitch. Thanks for coming on board.
My pleasure. My third book is going to be Six Pickles of Separation. It's going to be a cooking book.
Yeah, but make them sour pickles, not half sour. Go commit. If you're going to do it, commit.
Well, Montreal, where I live, is a big deli city, so I don't know if I can clearly commit. I think it takes all kinds in life.
Spoken like that's a very Canadian answer to that.
True. I'll apologize now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. And you want to apologize in advance for the next thing, just so we get it out of the way. We love our Canadian friends. So anyway, Mitch, you've got a really interesting platform. You've been doing this for a while, and to say the least, it's been wildly successful across multiple modalities: the authorship, the speaking, blogging, etc. So, share with it. How did we get to where we are? Because it's usually never a straight, linear, and logical answer to that question.
No, no. In fact, in my second book, Control Alt Delete, I talk about this sort of squiggly path that life is. It sort of doesn't really go sort of bottom left, top right corner, right? It doesn't move in that
Right.
way. If you really look back on my career, I sort of knew early on that I was interested in media. Back in the late 80s, when I was still in my teens, my first real professional job was actually interviewing Tommy Lee from Motley Crue. And
Oh yeah.
I jokingly tell people it was all downhill from there. Um, but yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of my time writing for magazines before there was an internet. I spent time back then actually publishing physical magazines. When the internet came online, I was very much there, and I spent a lot of time figuring out how to get media onto the internet. Helped launch one of the first search engines prior to Google existing. Got involved in mobile content 20 plus years ago, which is a day and age when there wasn't any smartphones or even a mobile web browser at that point. And then running a digital marketing agency. When I started the marketing agency with my partners in the early 2000s, I just wasn't really a natural salesperson. And so my default was, well, there's this cool new thing called blogging. Let me just sort of share my thinking. And I was doing it a lot, 7 times a week, basically, with no days off. And then when podcasting came out, I just thought, well, this would be an interesting way to take a bit of a break from writing. I could just talk. Um,
Right, right.
Little did I think, 14, 15 years later, I would still be publishing at that pace and both the podcast and the blog. Little did I think that that platform would lead to an interest in having two big, book deals,
Right.
nor a speaking career that came out of that for sure. So it was more, it was more a thing of just sort of rolling with the punches and doing what felt comfortable and doing what really felt somewhat natural to me. And I say somewhat natural because I don't think public speaking is ever natural unless you're a freak.
Right, exactly. So a couple things that you said there that are really interesting to me that I want to push on a little bit. So, you've gotten a couple of great book deals actually, right? But I would argue, and I'd want to get your take on this, that part of what the publishers saw in you is not just brilliant content, but you already had followership, you already had a platform, you already had an audience, and through the power of the internet, you know what they want from you and they know what to expect from you. So can you talk about sort of how that plays out? Because I think a lot of people are so content obsessed that they forget that you've got to have someone to put that content out to that it resonates with.
There's a lot of things underneath that. I think, here as we sit in 2019, having a platform is like the only reason most people get some kind of book deal unless they're famous. Back when I did my deals, which again was sort of the mid or early 2000s, it was a bit different. I think you're right in that there was an understanding by the publisher, and mine happened to be Hachette Grand Central, that there was going to be a lot of heavy lifting done by myself and my agency in terms of marketing and talking about it and speaking. And the answer to that is, of course, there would be. Like, we were excited to do it. But I also think that it was a time when publishers were very much looking to publish books on that topic. And again, you're sort of walking into a world where someone has a bit of a platform and is building a name, and they have a title like Six Pixels of Separation, which wasn't like a dummy's guide, not to belittle that. And it wasn't like a sort of digital marketing 101 or social media is happening. It sort of had a bit of a vibe and a flair to it. And they wanted a piece of that too. So it was a little bit different than it is today. But I mean, there's no doubt that when I sit down with authors and I do a lot of that work, when we look at things like the book proposal or what it takes to get in front of an agent or publisher or even self-publishing to create the business plan for it, the platform is huge. And what I mean by huge is not just that you have to have a huge platform. I don't think you have to have a huge one. You have to have one that really matters. And I think my big lesson over the decades that I've spent writing and building platforms, because even when I didn't own the platform, I still had a platform with major publications, is that you really have to, it's sort of two things. One is you have to really care about your audience, which I think is true, but I think more than caring for your audience, you really have to stay true to your voice. And my voice is a journey. My voice changes over time. My voice changes from the genres that I'm writing or talking in or speaking to. But, like, I care very little about my analytics. I care much more about what's in my notebook in terms of my thoughts and ideas and how they come to be crystallized, right? Is that an article? Is it a blog post? Is it a piece that goes into a speech? Is it something for a book? Is it all of the above? And I spend a lot of my energy, like I always call myself an infovore, like I just consume a lot of stuff, and I just spend a lot of my energy thinking about that stuff and where it might fit. And I'm very respectful of the audience. Like I'm not, I'm not one to just publish everything and put everything on Instagram and share everything on Facebook. And I try to be very, very selective and respectful of the publish button.
Okay, Mitch, that's fantastic. What are the things that have evolved or changed in a way that's really, really noticeable in the last 10 or 15 years, right? So when you started to build a followership and blog daily and such 15 years ago, the world was a little bit different. So if I were sitting there today at home thinking, all right, I'm going to do what Mitch did, I probably shouldn't follow that exact playbook, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, I'm very much a do as I say, not as I do. Because the type of content that I'm very passionate about isn't sort of the thing of the day. Like if you look at my content platform, it's long form text and long form audio. And the word of the day is like short video, live streaming, selfie Instagram. And even with podcasting being popular, like a lot of the shows are like, this was a shorter show, it's 20, 30 minutes. Mine tends to go, a bit longer, probably double that, sometimes triple, depending on the guest. So I mean, everything has changed in the sense of even speaking. There's this whole industry where people that come out of college and want to be a professional speaker. That's weird.
My guest is a really interesting man that I've known for a long time. His name is Corey Blake. He's the CEO and founder. He is an artist. He's a speaker. He's a storyteller. I'll give you his quick bio because it's interesting as I was reading through it earlier today. So Corey began his storytelling career as an actor, starting in one of the 50 greatest Super Bowl commercials of all time, which was Mountain Dew Bohemian Rhapsody, and in campaigns for American Express, Miller Beer, Mitsubishi, Wrigley's Gum, Hasbro, and a couple of other name brands. Today, Corey is the founder and CEO of Roundtable Companies, which is the publisher of Conscious Capitalism Press. He's a speaker, an artist, and a storyteller. One of the things that he does that's really interesting are these very cool comic books for folks like Tony Say and Marshall Goldsmith and Bob Cialdini. So he's a writer, he's a speaker, he's a publisher. So you meet all and more of the boxes that we like to have on. So welcome aboard, Corey.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. It's a pleasure.
So let me just sort of start with the obvious question: is how the hell did you get here? Like how do all these interesting things merge to a place where you're doing some great stuff in the world, having a blast, and making a living?
Certainly not through strategic planning, right? I couldn't have strategized this path for myself. I really thought that acting was going to be the thing for me. It was my source of identity for many many years of my life, and and actually, I mean, as I was born as a performer, shaped by a Jewish mother at a very early age, right? Happy mom is a happy life. If mom is laughing, things are better. So I really did think that was everything, and I knew that I felt that I was here to do something really special in the world, and to me, acting was the platform that was going to give me that opportunity, though I didn't ever think that acting unto itself was going to be the end means. So then, when it came to a point where as an actor, I was working, I was getting paid well, I was doing things other people thought was cool. I really felt like a crayon in other people's crayon box. I was brought in, and then I left. I was brought into other people's families, but I was always a guest for dinner. So it wasn't this sense of belonging that I was after. And so I left that, moved over to producing and directing storytelling, and learned how to build teams, and then started getting into the whole book world, where things don't get shelved as frequently, although that's a mistaken pun. uh, Such a stupid joke. But seriously, I mean, you don't need multi-million-dollar budgets in order to push a book out into the world and change lives. And so I headed down that path for quite some time, founded RTC in 2005, became a book writing company for many years. And then 2014, when I intersected with the conscious capitalism movement and met all of these amazing CEOs and presidents of companies who were trying to figure out this aspect of business that was more intuitive to me, I really shifted my purpose over, and we took our storytelling methodology from the book writing process and started applying it within organizations in all kinds of ways. And that's where serendipity just opened up a field of opportunity that we never could have planned for.
So, I love that you opened with there was no strategy involved, right? So the delta between 2005 and 2014 could have potentially been condensed if we had cracked the code on strategy at that juncture to say, listen, my sweet spot is this conscious capitalism thing. I happen to have all these other skills in terms of I'm a great storyteller. I know the art of publishing, and how do I mix all those things together? Although in retrospect, it's always great to say that. But it's interesting that what you're doing now is actually quite strategic, because storytelling's wonderful. It's a crowded space. Speaking's wonderful, a crowded space. Publishing, ditto. But you've got this really wonderful sweet spot that, by the way, happens to be very authentic and aligned with who you are and what you're about. So tell me about the difference between running the business now that you sort of found your lane, if you will, versus what it might have been like as it was in its earlier years, 205, 207, 2007, etc.
Yes, so a large portion of what we do, and certainly what I do, is entirely different on a day-to-day basis, right? So the first 9 years of the company was really me head down, focused on specific goals, chasing those goals, but not seeing anything outside of the lane I had created for where I thought we were intended to go. And in 2014, those blinders were ripped off, and my approach became far less agenda driven and goal driven and more purpose and values driven. And that's where all of these other kinds of opportunities started unfolding. So before then, we were almost entirely a book writing company. We wrote a specific kind of book, the book that people are born to write, which we talk about as what's the why behind what you're doing in your life, as opposed to just an information book. Um, and that means it's a more vulnerable product, right? So vulnerability did become an expertise of ours. We had to hold space for our clients for a year or more to help them
Sure.
say things they'd never said aloud to their spouse or even themselves, right? So that's a very specific process that we then, when the blinders came off, and people people were asking us to do things outside of the book realm, we got into documentary filmmaking. We got into creating art installations at events to help tell the community story. We got into all kinds of brand storytelling for organizations, both external as marketing, but also internally to help shift a culture, which is some of my favorite work. And now we've got organizations with which we do storytelling at scale, where we're collecting tens of thousands of stories or more. So it's been quite a journey. Like I said, I couldn't have seen that coming.
So what would you recommend to someone out there that's listening and they don't quite have their content nailed totally yet? Like, you've got your stuff nailed, and it took a while, right, to have multiple light bulbs and circumstances and opportunity to sort of own the vulnerability is sexy piece, which is very, very cool. But let's say someone's out there in whatever the space is. What would you advise them as either a thought leader or a publisher or a speaker in order to help them get to that moment where you go, this is that's it. That's the thing.
Well, first off, I'll say that I feel like I'm always still finding the thing, right? So that's still constantly evolving, which keeps it really exciting and makes my team absolutely insane because it's always evolving for me, and they have to figure out how to support that. But I think for me, the appetite for risk has been big.
Okay.
Coming from the acting background and getting comfortable with the idea that whether I'm hired or not, it oftentimes doesn't have anything to do with me.
So I want to push on that for a minute. I want to pause you there for a minute. So, given that your background is an actor, right? So you're going to go out and try to get a whole bunch of parts and not get most of them, and get one every X, whatever your batting average is. So
Sure.
failure
Yep.
that's part of the deal in that business, right? I think
Yeah.
for some thought leaders that come from an area of expertise, maybe they're an academic, maybe they're a CEO or a consultant or whatever. That 1 out of 10 success rate doesn't really feel comfortable for them. So they get a little bit
Totally.
more conservative, and they get, they'll make a mistake here and there, but 7, 8, 9, 9.5 out of 10 to fail, that's not how they're wired. So how do I get comfortable with, oh, well, I gave it a shot? Because that's sort of the actor's mantra, right? Like, got to get up there and go for it.
Yeah, I think finding something to practice that feels safe. I learned a lot through improv, right? Like there are certain things, and I know a lot of business people bring improv in
Yep.
for this very reason. It's a safer place to make a fool of yourself and get comfortable with actually how powerful it can be to fail, in a way that's quite outstanding. So it's not to say that it ever still feels good, but the after effects and the growth have been leapfrogs as opposed to baby steps. And I prefer to live in that space. But I had to your point, I had to be in an environment where I could get comfortable with that. And it wasn't necessarily going to be in front of my CEO and president colleagues. It was going to, it happened for me in the acting space where I got comfortable so that when I transitioned over, I wasn't doing it publicly in that way. I still am doing it publicly, but I'm much more comfortable now. So building up that comfort is key, whether it's an improv class or I imagine there are plenty of different opportunities where people can feel safer to explore and try things.
It's finding the safe venue, right? So if I'm a CEO out there listening, your next board meeting's probably not it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think so. I think you want to find something that's actually entirely separate so that you can practice in a different way.
Today, my guest is Rita McGrath. Rita Gunther McGrath is a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, a longtime professor at Columbia Business School, and she's widely recognized as a premier expert on leading innovation and growth during times of uncertainty, which I think most times are. She's consistently been in the top 10 on the Thinkers 50s list. She's written several books. Her latest, which just came out recently, and I had the pleasure of finishing a couple of weeks ago, is called Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. So welcome aboard, Rita. How are you today?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Great. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is you've been in an interesting place where you've written some books as a co-author, and then you've written them solo. So not that one is necessarily better than the other. I would say they're different, right? But maybe talk about the pluses and minuses and differences in going co versus a solo authored piece.
Sure. So let's talk about the content, but make that separate from the PR and how
Yes.
people regard the book, because these are two different things. I think the great thing about having a co-author, if you're developing content, is it gives you a sparring partner. It gives you someone to bounce ideas off of.
Right.
Sometimes they have a strength or an area they know about that you don't. So that can be very helpful. So from a writing process perspective, that's the good part. The bad part is, you can lose arguments. You can disagree about how things should go. You can sometimes find you're getting held up because there's something that just isn't gelling between the two of you. I mean, anything involving human beings. When you sole author, I think your relationship with your editor then becomes much more primary. You're not so much working with another peer, you're working with an editor who's got editorial judgment, and they're really speaking for the reader.
Sure.
So that's quite a different relationship.
What about alignment with the co-author? Because I've seen some cases where it's gone amazingly well, where a group of co-authors are totally passionate and aligned. And I'm thinking, for example, of Adrian Gostrick and Chester Elton. They've been together a long time as co-authors. They have very different skill sets, but it's been a long-term partnership, and then there's others who I won't name by name, where it's been sort of a rocky road, a bad marriage. It's ended in the equivalent of divorce post facto, and usually the root cause is there's a lack of alignment around I'm writing this book for X. So, what questions, or if you were talking to folks and advising folks that came to you and said, "Hey, we're going to co-author a book," are there some things that you would throw at them to say, "Well, consider these to make sure that you should do it together"?
Exactly. Well, you've got the question of what's your goal. And if they've got different goals, that's a red flash from the beginning. Then are they clear about who's going to take on what role? I mean, one of the things my co-author used to do that used to drive me absolutely bonkers was he'd write like one page of text and then hand it to me and say, well, you type really quickly. Why don't you turn this into a chapter? And I'm like, that's not the way we're going to play this game.
Yeah.
So I think those kinds of questions about working style and what do you like to have individual chapters or do you like to have the whole superstructure before you dive into the detail? I think the other thing that I think is really crucial is time. We all have different time demands. We all have different ways of working. And if your ways of working are incompatible, that can make you crazy.
And those are sort of and sometimes you don't know that the things that the partner's doing that makes you crazy, you have quirks as well.
Sure.
And because writing is typically, an individual sport, and now you move from a team sport, it's like going from playing, singles to doubles in tennis. Like it's just not for everybody.
Well, that's right. That's right. And the other thing, though, that I would like to mention to your audience, whom I know, I would imagine quite a fair number are women, is if you're a woman and you write with a man, that is a very dicey proposition. And there was some fabulous research done at Harvard of economists and what each additional article did for their chances at getting promotion, chances of winning tenure. And for men, it really didn't matter what the co-authoring was. For women, there was no impact if you wrote by yourself or if you co-authored with another woman. But if you wrote with a man, zero credit, like zip, zero zilch. The statistical effect completely disappears.
Really? So is it the assumption that the man wrote, like the man did all the work, or what? That seems crazy to me.
Well, doesn't it? I know. I mean, if I had been listening to my younger self hearing this on a podcast, I would have said she's crazy. This is 2019. Come on.
Right.
And I don't think it's conscious. I don't think people sit there and go, "Oh well,
Sure.
You must have done all the work." But I do think there is a difference as a woman when you write by yourself or you write with another woman. It's just a different way the world hears your voice.
That's sad. So let's go down that path for a minute because, in my world, in my business, I would say 60, maybe 65% of my clients are female, which is not representative of the market, right? So if we break that market into say, well, the speaking market, I would argue that the speaking market is probably not, by volume of speeches done, not people volunteering to speech, maybe 20% female,
Mhm.
You would know better than I, but at the university level, how many female professors are teaching at top business schools like Columbia? It ain't 60%. Right?
No.
So, let's talk about some of the unique challenges and opportunities that women have as authors and thought leaders and speakers. So, because there's good and bad in everything typically.
Sure.
So share with us some of your experience. Obviously, you're a tenured professor at Columbia, not chop liver, as we say, right? Like, so that's interesting. What has been, maybe let's start on the negative end of the, some of the challenges of being a woman in this world of content and thought leadership.
Well, I think it's the challenge that any minority group faces, which is, people don't know what to do with you. They don't have a neat category to put you in. And so there's a question of having to to make it easy for them to carve out and recognize what it is you do. I think that's one thing that is harder if you're a member of a minority group. They can't just pigeonhole you. So I think that's one thing that your readers really need to bear in mind if they're serious about this. Secondly, you have to really find your own style. And I've known a number of women that struggle with this because if you're in the minority group, and in this case, I'm talking about women, but it could also be if you're an unrepresented cultural or ethnic minority person, and it gets worse if you're both.
Right.
You have a much narrower range of acceptable behavior, or acceptable jokes, acceptable behavior on the stage. So I'll give you a specific example. You may remember Ian McMillan,
Sure.
who's my co-author for years and years.
Yep.
And the guy that always talked about how I typed so fast. But he would tell a joke, about the business logic of business class, right? And he would say, and I've tried many times to make up the difference in the price between business class and regular class with the free drinks they give you, and everybody yucks it up, and that's all great. Well, if I told that joke, people would be horrified. So the way I could tell a joke like that is to say, and I'm here to tell you, my husband has tried many times to make up the difference in free drinks, and it's not a pretty sight.
Really?
So, yeah. So, for your women listeners, you really need to get coaching on where for you those lines are, because if you're too friendly and approachable and warm, you're a lightweight. And if
Yep.
you're really aggressive and convinced of your point of view, you're abrasive or worse. And so I think there just is a whole different thing. And I don't think it's inherent to women or not. If I was giving this advice to a man presenting to like the committee of 200 or something, I'd be saying the same thing.
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. I'm really excited about my guest today. It's Joe Nocera. Joe is a Bloomberg opinion columnist. He's written columns for Esquire, GQ, the New York Times, former editorial director at Fortune, best-selling author, and as of late, I don't know what the equivalent of best-selling is, but has created a podcast called The Shrink Next Door, which if you haven't listened to it yet, you must. And it's been a bit of a runaway success with 13 million downloads. So welcome aboard, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
So I want to move to The Shrink Next Door for a minute, because when you and I met early this summer, I had just coincidentally finished listening to The Shrink Next Door and was blown away by it, just totally blown away. So I wonder if you could briefly tell us the story of how long this story was you were sort of with this story, and then I want to sort of move to the modality of podcasting, because that's a whole interesting universe. So tell the story of The Shrink Next Door, and then we'll talk about the podcast.
Well, I mean, the story is pretty simple. In 2010, I bought a house here in Southampton, and I was under the impression that the house next door was owned by a big shot New York psychiatrist, and that this other guy who was around the property all the time was his caretaker. And the shrink invited me over, my wife and I, over for drinks, and the house was just completely full of photographs of himself with famous people and so on. So come back the following summer, and the shrink's not there anymore. And the little guy who I thought was the caretaker comes over and he says, "Hi, Joe, I want you to meet my sister. I haven't seen her in 27 years.
Wow.
It's like, whoa. And then he goes on to explain that the reason is that the shrink had cut him off from everybody in his life and had essentially taken over his life. And that he, not the shrink, owned the house next door. And that he was not the shrink's caretaker, he was his patient."
Wow.
So, needless to say, that caught my attention. So, in 2011 and 2012, I worked sporadically on a magazine story about this situation, but it was ultimately not published. And I'm so grateful now that it wasn't, because I put it in my drawer. I put it in my drawer and kept it there till I joined Bloomberg in 2017. And I pulled it out and I showed it to the head of the podcast.
No, wait, I just want to say most journalists, Joe, have a story or two like that they got into, they dove into, they invested time, and then they filed away in the drawer for some reason, never to see the light of day. But you got sort of lucky that it was able to come back to life, right?
100%. If podcasting hadn't been invented, it would still be in the drawer. Because what really happened was that one of my sons, who's in the TV business, just called me up out of the blue one day and said, "Dad, you have to listen to this podcast." He was talking about Dirty John, which is Wondery's first big hit. And I listened to it and I called him back and I said, it's great, but why did you want me to listen to it? He said, "Because that's your story. Just take your story, do it in that format, and it'll work." And he was completely right.
So now talk about moving it from what was intended to be an investigative piece in a magazine, long form, to now, what's this podcast thing? And how do I do this, tell an amazing story, and what format? And like, how did you go through that process?
It was pretty wild. First of all, we were really lucky because Bloomberg wound up cutting a deal with Wondery to do it. a co-production. So we had these people who we knew could do this kind of thing really well. They hired a really terrific audio producer for me, and I knew who most of the characters were. There's a few who were new to the project, but most of them I had talked to back in 2011, 2012, and we just started interviewing them. That part was sort of normal, but not quite. It's not quite the same as interviewing somebody for print. There are certain details that you want in a podcast and certain sounds that you're looking for and all that sort of. So I learned about that. But the real learning experience for me came when it came time to write it because it was a very, very different kind of writing, much more like writing a script for a TV show where, you want to put the people on the edge of their seat every 15 minutes when you break for the commercial, and where there's a lot of thought goes into what to tell and what to hide and when to tell it and when to hide it.
You also chose as a format to have, in many instances, there were actors reenacting some of the characters' scenes, and then you had some of the actual folks that you were interviewing, and then you sort of overlaying the narration. So that's really, really intricate sort of weaving of what to reveal when, how to tell the story, when to get an actor to
Yeah.
reenact something. It was really wonderfully, wonderfully done.
Well, the actors were because we had no choice, really. No, seriously, we had all this written material from the shrink himself
Right.
from back in 2011, 2012, when he was busy, trying to keep the story out of the New York Times and writing these lengthy, lengthy memos defending himself. So we had that material, but he wouldn't talk to us. So we had to get somebody to read the material. We didn't have any choice.
Got it.
And then a second case, a woman who had been a patient and was willing to talk about him was worried that her voice was so distinctive that if she allowed a taping, she would be recognized. So we had to find a way to disguise her voice, and the easiest way to do that was just to hire somebody to read her lines.
So if she allowed the taping, people would recognize her even if you didn't mention her by name.
But otherwise, I know it's not that. I mean, the structure is different. But when you said, interweaving the characters and the other voices, it's not that different. That part of it, at least, from writing a book or a magazine story where you're narrating and then you're quoting somebody and then you're quoting a document and then you're back to narrating again, and you're using the quotes and the documents to pull the story forward, and because it's a better way to tell the story than if you keep narrating. And so that's that part of it, I would say, is the one part that was sort of similar.
Right. I mean, that's just the craft of storytelling, right? In a different way.
Right.
So now you've formatted this what would have been a long form magazine article into the podcast, which are 6 or 8 or whatever, 20, 30 minute, 35 minute episodes. What, if anything, did you need to do differently or need to do at all on the marketing side? Because now it gets unleashed into the world. Obviously you have Wonderly, obviously you have Blumberg, obviously it's a great story, but for every one of those there's 1,000 that sort of flop or get 12 downloads. How did it become a thing?
To be honest with you, I think, well, first of all, I think it became a thing because it was a good story, but also, I don't know how, but Wondery got great placement on the Apple iTunes website or app. So first week plus, it was the lead podcast in the new and notable section, which is the very first thing you see when you open the app. And then they time, I don't know quite how this works, but they time the first 3 episodes in a way to maximize how it will do on the Apple most listened to. So it popped to number 1 very quickly, and then it just stayed there for 3 weeks as people heard about it. And I did some interviews, but not a ton, really. And the interviews were more along the lines of writers wanting to write about the story rather than writing about the podcast. And the one place where we really got some help was the New York Times included it in its 6 great podcasts for this summer. So in terms of the marketing, I had to do less work myself, but that's because the marketers at Wondery really know how to do digital marketing.
Right.
But what I've noticed also about podcasts is that, sort of like streaming shows, word of mouth is huge. You see it on Twitter and you see it elsewhere. And I would ask people, where did you hear about The Shrink Next Door? And they'd say, well, my friend next door told me, or my friend at the office told me. And so, doing a good podcast and getting some word of mouth, that's really as important as anything.
I'm excited today about our guest, who is Steve Farber. I'll give you his bio real quick, and then we'll dive right into it. So Steve is the president of Extreme Leadership and the founder of the Extreme Leadership Institute. They work with organizations that are devoted to cultivation and development of extreme leaders in the business community, nonprofit, and education. His third book, Greater Than Yourself, The Ultimate Lesson in Leadership, was a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller. His second book, The Radical Edge, was hailed as a playbook for harnessing the power of the human spirit. And his first book, The Radical Leap, A Personal Lesson in Extreme Leadership, is a classic in the leadership field. And Steve just released earlier this month his fourth book, which is Love is Just Damn Good Business. And give you a little background on Steve. He's been in this game for a long time. He was a director of service programs at TMI. He served as, and this is probably one of the oddest titles I've ever seen, VP and official mouthpiece of the Tom Peters Company for a long time, and has been mentored by Tom, Jim Kouzis, and Terry Pierce. So welcome aboard, Steve, and congrats with the launch of the new book.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for that as well.
Cool.
It's great to be here with you.
So I've seen you speak several times, read all your books, etc. There's clearly a strong leadership foundation in everything that you do. Obviously, with the relationship with Tom and Jim, so it's there. You can see it, you can smell it, you can feel it. Yeah. And what I would call sort of the Farber flavor is adding the love to that, right? So if it was a movie, it's sort of like the love child of sort of Tom Peters and Tony Robbins is probably a bad example, but yeah. but what you're making unique about it is, yes, there are fundamental principles in leadership that are what they are, period, full stop. How do you bring that to life in a way that's unique and different and forces and creates the resonance? And what you've done is you've pulled love through that, and then obviously you have the sort of the personal style of the way you get it out there. But that to me is a great example of thought leadership, because you could have, it sounded like what you originally tried to do is, let me go reinvent this leadership thing, right? And said, oh shit, probably not going to happen. And then you found sort of the love path, and that was way more than enough to differentiate you from hundreds of others in the marketplace.
Yeah, and to just dive into that a little bit more, it's not that I'm the only person that's ever identified love as being critical in leadership. I mean, in fact, Jim Kouzis and Barry Posner, they have their 5 practices of exemplary leaders, and one of them is encouraging the heart. And Jim was the first person that I ever heard talk about love as the foundation of leadership. Yeah. And for me, it rang through. Oh. It rang through as being. Did you see how that rang?
That rang was like our special effects team is so good.
I know.
Wow, I said it was amazing.
If everything in my life worked that way, it would be phenomenal. $6 million. Nope, didn't work. Okay. Anyway, so what I found was that for me, that resonated so deeply, and it made me start looking at that element in particular, this love thing. How prevalent is that really? And so my work has really been around giving it a fuller focus and fleshing it out more, so we can really take that as an overt challenge, not kind of a by the way.
Right. You're putting it out there.
Yeah, it's the thing. So yes, that's right. It's certainly I didn't invent love, and it's not an entirely new thought in the context of business. I mean, Tim Sanders wrote Love is the Killer App 2 years before The Radical Leap came out. It was like 2001 or 2002 something.
Well, I was just going to mention Tim, because when Tim did it, it was a much higher hill to climb, if you think about it in the context of timing. And so you're standing a little bit on his shoulders, but it's more acceptable to use that language today.
No doubt about it.
And pump has been primed.
Yeah, it has. And we've all been collectively priming that pump for quite some time. But still, what really surprises me about this, continues to surprise me about this, Peter, is that, see, how can I put this? There's a weird dynamic that happens, particularly around this love thing. There is, in my experience, I can't prove this scientifically, but most people really already think this way. Most successful people really think this way already. There's this collective kind of unspoken acknowledgement that this is really important. And yet there's also this collective belief that most people don't feel this way. So most of us feel this way, and most people think, and we all think that everybody's going to be resistant to this.
Well, and it's about giving ourselves the permission to express this in the workplace in an appropriate way. Things that we do in our personal lives and with our friends and with our families and all that other stuff, those are the relationships that are most valuable, right? So
Absolutely. And listen, we all know that that employee engagement is something that we should be chasing after. We all know that collaboration and teamwork, and we've been using this language all the time.
Sure.
Well, love is what brings all that together and really takes it to its highest possible level, in my opinion. So what happened for me then was I began to ask myself that question: what do I think about all this? And in answering that question, the LEAP framework was the first thing to emerge: love, energy, audacity, and proof, which I wrote about originally in The Radical Leap.
Yep.
And it's a methodology now that's been out there for quite some time, and people are having great results with it. But once that kind of framework was established, and I wrote a couple of books around it, then of course it leads to, well, how do we teach people? How do we help people apply these things, beyond being up on stage and in the pages of a book?
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.